Welcome back to Church and State with Christopher Ferrara and Brian McCall. While we laugh as we document the decline of church and state at ever new levels every 2 weeks.
Ha, ha, ha.
Feeling like laughing today, Chris?
Well, my thesis for the paper I'm going to deliver at Lake Garda is that all legitimate laughter, not the laughter of cruelty, but all legitimate laughter, is the uncovering of a truth. Either an incongruity or a falsehood or an offense against the divine order, as to which God himself has laughed before he destroys it.
Yes.
As the Old Testament says, he shall laugh the nations to scorn.
Well, he's got a lot to laugh about right now. But we're going to start in church. We have a legal matter. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, the former apostolic nuncio to the United States, who in 2018 made headlines for denouncing Pope Francis as covering up sexual abuse, particularly that of Theodore Cardinal McCarrick, was summoned, according to a decree released by Vigano just this week on June 20th, to the Vatican for a, quote, extrajudicial proceeding, in which he's accused of, and I want to read these out because I think they're really interesting. He's accused of the crime of schism for three things: public statements which result in a denial of the elements necessary to maintain communion with the Catholic Church, denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis, rupture of communion with him, and rejection of the Second Vatican Council.
That's a familiar litany. When do we get our trials?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. As to the first one, I mean, as far as I know, this bishop has never denied any dogma of the Catholic faith. So to say he does not possess the elements to maintain communion with the Catholic Church, I don't know what Catholic Church they're talking about, but the Catholic Church that he professes to be a bishop of, again, he's never denied, as far as I'm aware, anything related to that. And what does rejection of the Second Vatican Council mean? An undefined term. The most interesting, though, I think, is the rejection of the denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Because he's not a sedevacantist as far as I know. So he's not saying that he isn't the Pope, but he's certainly saying he's not a legitimate Pope in the sense that he's obviously an enemy of the faith. His words and deeds betray him in that regard. So, even mainstream commentators have said this Pope is a menace to the faith. People who have never said anything like that about any Pope. Not even during the worst years of John Paul II when he was doing the Assisi events. But as to this Pope, it's undeniable. He's attacking the faith, especially in the area of morality.
Well, it's interesting because, either they're saying he's a sedevacantist and is doubting the validity of Pope Francis' election, but they don't use that word.
No.
In which case, they've never, to my knowledge, tried any sedevacantist, and there's certainly a lot to choose from in the last 60 years. But secondly, the most I've seen Vigano say is he has certainly raised doubts about the regularity of the conclave, the state of Francis's consent. But in the statements I've read, he ends it by saying, but, I cannot judge. I'm raising these concerns, but only a juridical structure of the church can judge these and make a declaration about it. But they're almost saying, if that's what they're concerned with those statements, that to even raise a question and say, there's smoke here, somebody better look, is equivalent to, a crime.
Well, he only raises questions, but the history of the church is rife with people questioning the outcome of conclaves. Take the Great Western Schism, for example. That's the primary example. 3 competing contenders to the papal throne. So that took decades to sort out. So the idea that one cannot even raise the question about irregularity of a conclave, if that's what they mean by the questions of legitimacy of the Pope, is ridiculous. It's contrary to church history. If you were to say that Francis is an anti-Pope in the literal sense, that he was not validly elected and that the see is vacant, that would be one thing.
But see, I don't actually think that would even be schism, right? Because
it wouldn't be.
Again, schism is I deny the Pope has any authority and I don't follow him. The identity of the person holding it. Again, I'm not a sedevacantist. I'm not saying it's right, but even if he were, is not denying the authority of the Roman pontiff. It's just saying, I don't think this guy is it, which is a factual question.
Well, hasn't Vigano said something along the lines of, I refuse communion with this counterfeit church?
Again, he has said things like that, which are not legal terms. I mean, think they're rhetorical flourishes. I mean, much like Marcel Lefebvre, said, we do not have communion with neo-modernist Rome. I mean, he didn't mean literally I don't have communion with them. It was a rhetorical way of saying I'm not going along with their error.
I think a stronger case could be made that Francis is in schism. I'm only half facetious, because theological writers have discussed the hypothesis of a schismatic pope who would seek to destroy the church as something that could actually happen. And then there's theological speculation about what would happen if such a pope came along. Would there have to be some sort of imperfect council to declare that this pope is a schismatic and we must not have communion with him? I'm not saying that's the case here, but it's certainly within the realm of theological speculation that a pope could be in schism from the church. So, what is Vigano talking about? He's talking about this idea that with the Second Vatican Council, somehow, in some way they never explain, different articles of faith emerged to which we must somehow profess our adherence, not only the submission of mind and will, but some sort of religious adherence to the Second Vatican Council as event. But what it is about that event we have to accept that differs from what Catholics always believe, they never tell us.
Well, you're right. Exactly. That's the point. I mean, when they say rejects the council, he doesn't deny the historical fact that it occurred.
Yeah, Francis rejects the council.
Right.
He rejects far more of the council than we do. Right. For example, he certainly rejects the idea, as we read in the council documents, that the Pharisees pressed for the death of Christ.
Yes.
It's in Nostra Aetate. That they pressed for the death, the leadership of the Jewish people in occupied Palestine at that time, pressed for the death of Christ. They are responsible for it. He would not have died if not for that. He would reject that. He would reject also the correct interpretation of the term subsisted, which Pope Benedict finally corrected through the CDF. I think it was around 2007, 2008. Subsisted means basically a fuller form of is. So the true Church of Christ is the Catholic Church and none other. There isn't any church outside of the visible Catholic Church. There might be operations of grace. There might be a valid baptism performed by a heretic who intends to do what the church does. Even an atheist can perform a valid baptism. There could be a valid marriage if you're married before God with the intention to be married for life and bring children into the world. But there is no church outside of the Catholic Church. Francis obviously rejects that. I'm not even sure he thinks the Catholic Church is necessary in any sense of the word for anybody's salvation. He certainly doesn't give any indication that he believes that. So,
yeah, I think he's missing a word. Extra ecclesiam salus is what I think. Outside the church, there is salvation, is what I think he believes.
Well, Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope, talked about this whole idea of the upright person whose conscience tells him that he's doing the right thing, and therefore you've dispensed with necessity of the sacraments and belief in revealed dogmas. And the result is the demissionization of the church. He talked about that, I believe it was in 1997, in an address to the United States bishops. And he said, this is a terrible doctrine. It basically says that faith is a burden imposed on people who are in good conscience. Why burden them with all these truths they have to believe in if their conscience alone saves them, whether it's an ill-formed conscience, whether it's an erring conscience or not, as long as they can claim, I have good conscience. And this seems to be what Francis is promoting. I hadn't seen the slightest indication throughout the 13 years of this pontificate that he thinks that in any sense one needs to be a Catholic in order to be saved, to profess the Catholic faith in order to be saved, to have access to the 7 sacraments in order to be saved. For him, it seems the church is just another participant in the New World Order.
Well, actually, as Vigano has said himself in one of his writings, the church has just become a bureau or an office of the deep state.
And anything that harkens back to the church that St. Augustine described as ever ancient and ever new, meaning the liturgy, which is timeless, that he despises. And now we hear rumors apparently well-founded rumors, that he's not satisfied with his attempt to extirpate the traditional Latin Mass. Now he's going to pursue the nuclear option and simply abolish it, as if that were possible. And those rumors do seem to be well-founded, and there's even a date proposed that it would happen on July 16th.
Again, I think the indications seem to be something like that is happening. My own prediction is it will be a further pretty dramatic suppression, but won't be as far as they're saying. Because I think what he likes to do is sort of release predictions about this is what it's going to do, and it's not quite so bad. So people say, oh, phew, wow, we dodged a bullet, even though it is a bullet. It's just a smaller bullet. So that's my guess. I could see, I'll make my prediction, a decree saying, once any exemptions that have already been granted by the dicastery for divine worship have expired, no new will be granted, and no traditional mass will be celebrated in any parish or cathedral church. And essentially just leave the Ecclesia Dei churches is what I predict they're going to do. But
yeah, well, I don't see him being able to pull off an attempt to abolish the traditional Latin Mass within the so-called Latin Mass communities already chartered by previous popes, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Society of St. John Cantius, and so forth. I don't see him attempting to abolish those provisions, because that would be a literal total abolition of the traditional Mass, and we'd be back in the catacombs again.
Well, but I think it's the parish churches that they're most concerned about, because I think what they saw, obviously there had been growth of tradition before that, but after 2007, when local parish priests just said, hey, well, Pope wants me to try this, I'll do this. And they just offered it in the church people normally went to. I think the growth was explosive. And they realized we can't have it convenient in your local church because people might actually go. So I think their real focus is getting it out of the parish churches. Okay, do you really want to drive an hour to go get it? We'll let you have it at a Institute of Christ the King or something, in some broom cupboard somewhere. But we want it not accessible, I think.
These leaders of the church, Francis, obviously at the head of the whole group of them, they remind me of these insane doctors and nurses who kill their patients in hospitals. So what they want to do here is put a pillow over the patient's face and make sure the patient is dead. The Novus Ordo is dying. They want to complete the self-demolition of the church. Because as we see now, the Novus Ordo parishes have no growth. The Novus Ordo seminaries are empty. The Catholic schools that follow a non-traditional route are closing in droves. It's basically a self-destructive, or as Cardinal Ratzinger said, a continuing process of decay since the Second Vatican Council. It's rotting and falling apart before their very eyes, and they're determined to keep it going.
Yeah.
Well, there's nothing left.
Well, and again, I don't think there's a coincidence between this trial starting of Archbishop Vigano and what seems like it'll happen next month, because clearly he's been very outspoken in defense of the traditional Latin Mass for the last 6 years or so. And, it's just the hypocrisy of this when there's a cardinal in the Vatican who's published pornographic, obscene books. There are priests and bishops around the world denying not only articles of the faith, but the natural law. Advocating for the performing of, quote, marriages of same-sex people. And, this 80-year-old retired bishop who does nothing but sort of post things on the internet gets brought in on a trial, right?
This is the same old story reaching perhaps its bitter conclusion since the Second Vatican Council began. And it echoes the Arian heresy, when the heretics had the real estate and the faithful were out in the deserts. And this is what we see again, the real estate theory of communion. If you occupy diocesan property, you're in communion with the church, no matter what you profess, no matter what heresy you profess, no matter what corruption you're engaged in, because you have the real estate. And those who have the faith are being evicted from the real estate. So they're not in communion anymore.
Right. Well, I guess the only crime in the church is to be Catholic.
Yeah. No, that was exactly the lament of St. Basil the Great during the Arian heresy.
Yeah.
The faithful are driven into exile while the heretics are in control of everything, seemingly. And that crisis took 60 years to resolve, or coming up on 60 years since the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council. So we'll see. This is going to be a very dramatic year in many ways.
Well, we've been saying that. But before we leave this topic, I guess you have a little more familiarity with canon law than I do. What do you make of this that's, quote, an extrajudicial trial as opposed to an actual canonical trial? Why would they Why would they be doing that? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, it's going to be an immediate sentence. Sentence first, verdict later. It's Alice in Wonderland stuff, and there won't be any appeal because it's going to come from the highest juridical body in the church, the Apostolic Signatura. So that's his.
Well, it's funny. Vigano says the same thing in his response to it, his public declaration. He says they are pursuing this with an already decided verdict with the fanatical zeal of a Cromwell.
Of course, no, he's already been. The paper has already been written. The decree has already been signed. He's just going to show up to have it handed to him.
Well, no, it reminds me of the trial of Thomas More when Thomas Cromwell is prosecuting him, and the judge turns to the jury and says, will the jury retire to consider the evidence? And he says, considering the evidence, I don't think you should need to retire. Wink, wink, nod, nod.
Gee, we could say that about a certain former president of the United States.
Well, with that, we'll turn to the state, but we're not going to talk about him.
No, enough of that.
I mean, there's we'll talk about that, I'm sure,
enough
later.
of the end of the American Republic. Let's talk
exactly. But no, we do actually have some two good stories to talk about here, about a little bit of life in the body politic here. One is in Missouri, and there's actually one judge in the legal system who seems to have a sense of normalcy. There was a group of Christian, Jews, and other religious leaders who sued to enjoin Missouri's fairly restrictive abortion ban on the grounds that it violated religious freedom to have an abortion ban. And their argument was the preamble to the statute mentioned Almighty God, and then the preamble also mentioned that the state believes that life begins at conception. Well, the judge, interestingly, in his ruling said, well, if I have to invalidate this statute, I guess I have to invalidate the Missouri Constitution, which also in its preamble acknowledges Almighty God. And the fact that life begins in conception is not a religious truth, it's a scientific truth. And he threw their lawsuit out. So there's actually one judge that knows what they're doing. And then secondly, before we get your thoughts on it, in the great state of Louisiana, they've just passed a law requiring schools to have the 10 Commandments just on display in classrooms. And just to give you a flavor of how this has made liberals seem red, I want to read just the beginning of a story about this from the Guardian, the Guardian of Communism newspaper. They say, Louisiana's decision to force public schools to display the 10 Commandments is the latest fallout from a spate of controversial rulings from the U.S. Supreme Court, which has opened up a Pandora's box that is fueling efforts to turn America into a theocratic state.
Well, I'm old enough to remember sitting in an elementary school classroom, a public school, PS 71 in the Bronx, and on the wall to my right were the 10 Commandments. That was in the 1960s. But then in 1980, in the case of Stone v. Graham, the Supreme Court struck down a statute requiring the posting of the 10 Commandments in a classroom. And by the way, isn't it strange how Supreme Court cases of landmark significance involving religion and morality are eponymous? Stone v. Graham. The commandments are written in stone. Roe v. Wade. The embryo is a kind of human roe. And there's another case that I won't mention, which is equally eponymous and quite shockingly so, involving the so-called right to sodomy. So I find that an interesting little tidbit. But I don't know what the Supreme Court will do with that now, because under the Lemon test, you have to articulate some kind of secular purpose. So you have to say, I don't know, the promotion of good morals, because the 10 Commandments, after all, bind everyone. Thou shalt not kill. Do you have a problem with that?
Right. Which one do you have a problem with? The stealing? The killing?
I guess the first 5 of the Decalogue would cause a problem.
Right.
But the negative precepts, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. What? That's just basic law.
Right.
It's even reflected in the positive law. So I guess they have a problem with thou shalt not have false gods before me. Or thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath day. So, that's a problem for them, but there are still some places that have Sunday closing laws. Bergen County, New Jersey, for example. just because the people have the right to decide that on Sunday there will be no commerce. So I don't know how this statute will fare. It will certainly be struck down by a district judge at some point. Because in that circuit, the district courts are loaded with liberals, even in the circuit that includes Louisiana. So we'll see. But it may make its way to the Supreme Court. But if the statute is struck down and that invalidation is upheld by the circuit court, I don't know if the Supreme Court would even take it.
The Supreme Court, who, by the way, delivers opinions underneath a painting of Moses the lawgiver giving the Ten Commandments, right?
And takes an oath to God, so help me God.
Right.
No.
Exactly. Well, and again, at least, I mean, American history is certainly very complicated. You've written a whole book on at least the first half, a little more than the first half of American history. So certainly we would agree America was not founded as a Catholic state, but it's certainly throughout its history. I mean, you mentioned just the Ten Commandments in the classroom, but there are references to God, to basic religious truths, the Ten Commandments, all throughout our history, through starting with the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, all the way through. Again, so although it has not been a Catholic country, it has been a country where religious speech has not been banned from public life.
Yeah, well, there's a Supreme Court case involving the Ten Commandments. I mentioned it in the book. I forget the name of the case as I sit here. It was a 5-4 decision in which a public display of the Ten Commandments was barely upheld as something utterly devoid of religious significance. This was a purely historical monument. But if it were to be the case that it had any religious intention behind it, of course, it must be struck down. So you can make these, symbolic representations of religious things as long as it's clear they don't have any religious significance.
Right.
They have to be historical monuments of some kind.
Unless they're historical monuments of Confederate leaders.
Yeah, of course. Which involves the court in basically assessing the furniture of public buildings. See what the intention is behind the furniture. Interior decorators, as it were. So that's the situation we're in. We don't have a religious commonwealth in any sense of the word. So the idea of a separation of church and state carried to its logical conclusion would require any reference to God, according to their interpretation of this notion, to be banished from the classrooms. And yet, as I said, when I was growing up, the Ten Commandments were in the classroom because everyone then agreed that, Ten Commandments are so basic, they really should bind everybody. No matter what your God is, you don't want to have false gods, do you?
Right.
And so on and so forth. And certainly, killing and stealing and adultery and bearing false witness, i.e. perjury, everyone agrees those things are wrong. But apparently we've reached the terminal insanity stage of the decomposition of the republic, where you can't even mention things that bind all men, which are matters of natural law. Not allowed. But as you say, you can take an oath to God to be a Supreme Court justice.
Right. Well, but again, I think it's really both in church and state. We see all these parallels. The natural law is the target now. I mean, Pope Francis has put its sights directly on it, essentially saying the natural law doesn't bind. It's not universal. It doesn't really matter. It's case by case. There is really no natural law. And if there is one, nobody can really know it anyway. So God can't hold us responsible. And that's also what the secularists want to do, right? They want to remove not just overtly religious thing, but just any reference to the natural moral law.
But let's keep in mind that Archbishop Vigano is schismatic.
Well, of course. Serious problem, though, going to be solved in the church.
We might have a pope who doesn't believe in the natural law as binding on all men and women, regardless of their religion, universally throughout the world. We might have a pope who believes that. But the real problem is Archbishop Vigano and his pesky blog posts.
Right, exactly.
Other documents. He must be excommunicated.
Well, maybe they can throw him and Trump in the same cell. They're about the same age. He's a little old.
Well, more good news, I guess. But, the next time we do this will be in the month of July. And depending on when we do it, we'll find out if the former president of the United States is in a jail cell or not.
That's right. We'll see if, I don't know, do Secret Service agents get paid extra pay for working in a jail? I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
There's discussion of such things as, well, maybe they could set up a special trailer for the president on Rikers Island, a prison trailer for Trump.
Right.
I have to think the Supreme Court's going to get involved in that ridiculous outcome.
Well, we'll see. So tune in a couple weeks, and maybe we'll have some things to discuss on that front. But as we do, we're approaching the first Friday, first Saturday, particularly the first Saturday, as Our Lady requested that at Fatima. So remember the Fatima Center 100 by 100 campaign, trying to get 100,000 first Saturday communions of reparation by the 100th anniversary of Our Lady's request. So please go over to the Fatima Center's website and take a look at that if you can. That's something you can do to bring about the reign of the Immaculate Heart.
And until the next time, if there is a next time. I'll be doing this from Italy, by the way, at the annual symposium of the Roman Forum in Lake Garda.
Well, you'll be much more relaxed. We'll see. Maybe you can do it with an Aperol Spritz in your hand.
Well, we don't want to do that, do we?
All right. Safe travels, Chris.
Take care. God bless.